All right, YouTube. It turns out that the people in Africa, specifically Zimbabwe, don't like being colonized by the Chinese any more than they like being colonized by the Europeans. Now, there were rumblings of this more than a year ago. People were starting to talk online in some of the African forums. Yes, I am familiar with several. As well as elsewhere, where there, even in 4chan, where there's the occasional African poster talking about how the way the Chinese were really treating the native population, where Chinese nationals have gone under the auspices of people like Mugabe, who are partnered with China. They want development. They want factories to go up and roads and stuff. Talking about how they were mistreating them worse than any fucking European colonials ever did. Minus the Belgians. Sorry for the Belgian Congo, I suppose they say as they churn their chocolate out in record totals. The Chinese have this weird habit. The Chinese government, it's all centrally run. They'll go in and build like factories or stuff. They're still paying African workers cents on the dollar for producing these goods, and they're embezzling everything else in order to ship it to the West. It's gotten to the point where China is on the crux between being an undeveloped shithole full of, gutter oil, and being, at least in the coastal areas especially, being a marginally developed, industrialized nation. They do have a lot of heavy industry now. And so people in urban areas in China that are like connected to Chinese infrastructure, they want to earn more for their work. So all of the sort of sweatshop style labor that was done in China is increasingly being outsourced by China to an even deeper, darker part of the third world where people have lower expectations of personal safety and environmental protection and workers' rights and how much they get paid. The Chinese, if they can get a bunch of 8-year-olds to make cheap clothing for 2 pennies an hour, I suppose that's better than having a bunch of 10-year-old Chinese workers that do it for like 20 cents an hour, because they can re-import those goods. They call them Chinese. They're manufactured in China because we sewed a button onto this shirt, and then they just re-import it back to the Western world, and it's even cheaper to feed the West's own desire for cheap goods. So the new colonialism, it's not being led by a bunch of white European evil bigot Nazi racists. It's not being led by horrible imperialist Uncle Sam. It's primarily China, and it's pissing off opposition parties all over the African continent. Here you have a case where the party that's actually in command, Mugabe's party, they have no problem with. They don't care if workers are exploited because there's higher development. They get some of that money in taxes, and they can keep drinking their Russian vodka and eating their caviar and getting all of their luxury goods and wearing their like solid gold fucking chains and stuff. The typical sort of big man with the stick politics that still unfortunately reigns in some parts of Africa. You go to other parts and it's like very westernized. You go to Nigeria or something, it's some good shit. I wouldn't mind visiting a place like Ghana or Tanzania, one of these countries that's sort of resisting the Chinese bullcrap, or Ethiopia, a place with a tribal tradition that's actually proud and it was fucking multicultural 1,000 years ago and now has become monocultural because of that, sort of homogenized but still a pretty cool place to be. You go to a place, though, like, again, Zimbabwe, and the Chinese just pour in by the tens of thousands. They're raping women in these countries. They're stealing the wives of people who can't afford them as compared with a Chinese national who themselves, the Chinese, like, clerical worker only makes like maybe a couple $100s a year anyway, but it's still like 10 times what the Africans they're working in the factory are making. So fucking that Chinese guy finds a hot African wife and says, oh, well, this is great because I'm rich here. Back in China, I was just a fucking peasant, but now that I'm working here as like a middle management consultant or something, or doing the secretarial work here in Africa, I feel great. And it must be a little bit like how like the British or the French or something, when they encountered all these Africans that they were putting to work in the fields, it must be a little bit like how they felt. They're like, wow, I've back in fucking England, they wanted to impress me on a ship, or back in France, all I had was like this little fucking cabbage patch. Now all of a sudden I'm here, and like all these people, they look at me as some sort of fucking god man or something because I have more than a fucking franc in my wallet. And it must be kind of the same, but the Chinese are exploiting them 10 times worse than what any European ever did. And the funny thing is, because the Chinese still are, in a de facto sense, are run by the Communist Party, even though they're really socialists, they're not communists anymore. A lot of the Starbucks Marxists in the West, you know, the people who they talk about how great Mao or Lenin or Stalin or something was, and they do it on like their iPods, and that while drinking Starbucks and shit like that, and they have like the cheap Walmart Che Guevara shirt or something. These fucking whiners, they'll whine about Western imperialism all day, but when the Chinese go in and set up sweatshops all over Zimbabwe, the Africans will talk about how bad it is, and these fucking Starbucks Marxists that if you criticize Obama over here, they call you like a despicable racist. They'll say, oh, well, these are evil capitalist Africans, so it doesn't count. And it's just all sorts of fucked up and weird, because the Chinese are actually the ones now exploiting the African continent and draining it dry of its remaining resources. They're the ones like putting people in blood diamond mines, and they fucking take those and like try to sell them to the Swiss or something like that. They're the ones that are taking all the crops and then calling them Chinese and selling them to the Western world. They're the ones, again, some Chinese government employees gets a bright idea. We'll set up a factory in Zimbabwe. And so they have a bunch of Africans working for 10 cents an hour or less, or 10 cents a fucking day, to make these like cheap linens and stuff. They re-import them to China because it's cheap for them to do that. You know, it adds maybe a couple cents a unit per cost. By cost. And then they sew, again, like a little bit of embroidery or a button on in China, and they can still export it as a Chinese good, even though it's an African good. I mean, it's strange to me that like black nationalists aren't complaining. They're complaining about like European bigots, American bigots, you know, white people in Africa, get the fuck out. And yet the Chinese are in there literally by the tens of thousands in some of these countries, completely exploiting and laying waste to everything. And they say nothing. And when you do hear it, it comes from some opposition party that's not even in power. Mugabe's like the fucking stick-wielding tyrant big man, and just a fucking retarded socialist who doesn't even give his people any of the socialized stuff that is promised to them. Like, there's no fucking welfare. Maybe you can go to the health clinic, you know, and get an AIDS drug once a year or something so you don't completely keel over. And that's about all these people get in return for the Chinese. The Chinese, like, they build roads, and the only people with cars are Chinese nationals. They'll build a train, and the only people that can afford a ticket are Chinese nationals. They build a factory, but none of the decent jobs go to anybody who's not a Chinese national. You know, even when the Europeans or fucking anybody else was dabbling around the third world, at least they would try to get some of the natives into positions where they could have a little bit of dignity. The Chinese don't even bother to do that. The only person they care about in all of Zimbabwe is Mugabe himself. And they realize, oh, well, he'll just fucking, if anyone messes with us, he'll beat him down. So a lot of people now are saying they need to evict all the Chinese from their countries. They're almost calling for the Europeans to come back in and be the ones developing things. It's like parts of Africa where the United States is at large are doing far better than the places being exploited by the Chinese. So really, it's a new form of imperial colonialism. It's just, it happens to be Asian people doing it, so I guess the Starbucks Marxists are willing to ignore it. That's about all. Peace out.